Have you ever wondered why we admire strength so much but at the same time fear it? Why do we silently envy those who seem to live with intensity, courage, and vitality, but prefer to retreat into the comfortable shell of fragility, where nothing is required of us, where we can protect ourselves behind the excuse of, "I can't"? Nietzsche dared to put his finger on this wound. And he did it brutally without mercy. He said, in other words, that humanity had learned to love weakness, to transform it into virtue. And because of that, he hated the weak. Of course, this isn't hatred in the vulgar sense. He wasn't mocking those who suffer, nor condemning those who experience the natural weight of human pain. What Nietzsche was attacking was something deeper, the exaltation of impotency as if it were a supreme value. What he called slave morals, a morality constructed by those who did not have the strength to live fully, and who, instead of recognizing their own limitations, decided to invert the scale of values. Suddenly, being humble became more noble than being creative. Being obedient became more virtuous than being free. And accepting one's own weakness came to be seen as superior to transforming it into strength. Nietzsche looked at this world and was revolted. He saw a humanity sickened by resentment, transforming the inability to live into a moral discourse against life itself. And that made him sick. But maybe you're wondering, what does this have to do with me? What does it have to do with the modern world, with my life? The answer is, everything. Because if you look closely, the society we live in is still immersed in this paradox. We live in a time when the word force has almost become an insult, as if being strong was arrogance and being fragile was a form of moral purity. And in this silent game, we end up feeding a culture in which victimhood is more appreciated than courage. Nietzsche couldn't stand this. Not because he despised those who suffer, but because he believed that suffering should drive us to overcome, not to the cult of passivity. Pain, for him, was the cradle of creation, art, philosophy, and vital force. Denying it, hiding it, or turning it into an excuse for stagnation, that was unforgivable. Maybe that's why his writings still feel like a punch in the gut. They are not comfortable. Nietzsche does not write to calm. He writes to set fire. To tear off the masks that protect us but also imprison us. And here is the paradox that will permeate our entire reflection. Nietzsche hated the weak, but what he wanted most was for us to stop loving our own weakness. That we would be able to look at suffering, at loneliness, at the inevitable pain of life, and transform all of this into creative energy, in will to power, in force that expands. That is the invitation of this video. It is not a condemnation but a provocation. A call to question the extent to which our own lives are guided by the morality of weakness, and the extent to which we have the courage to seek strength. And maybe you're already feeling the discomfort. Perhaps part of you wants to reject Nietzsche outright, saying, "This is cruelty, this is a lack of compassion." But Nietzsche believed precisely this, that discomfort is the beginning of growth. If you are restless, it is because something in you has been touched. And that's why I invite you, stay. Stay in that discomfort. Because in the next parts, we will explore in more depth what Nietzsche really meant. Let's understand how the morality of the weak emerged, why it spread throughout culture, and how it still shapes the way we think, feel, and relate to each other today. Nietzsche was always a disturbing thinker, not because he sought easy answers, but because he dared to attack humanity's deepest illusions. Among his most controversial provocations is his relentless critique of what was called weakness. Not the natural vulnerability of human beings, but the exaltation of impotence, victimhood, and passivity as if they were virtues. In this video we'll explore why Nietzsche hated the morality of weakness, delving into concepts like slave morality, resentment, and the will to power, and reflecting on how these ideas still resonate in our modern world, a time when frailty is often celebrated more than courage. If you liked the video, leave your like and subscribe to the channel to help me and let me know that you like videos like this. For Nietzsche, the history of human morality is not just a record of universal values, but a battlefield. And in this field, he identified two fundamental forces: morals of the gentleman and slave morals. The master's morality was born of vitality. It was the morality of the strong, of those who affirmed life in all its intensity. In it, good did not mean obedient, submissive, or resigned. Good, for the strong, was that which expressed power, creativity, and expansion. It was living without fear of oneself. Slave morality, on the other hand, arose as a reaction. It was the morality of the powerless, of those who could not defeat the strong in action. Unable to face life head-on, they found another way. They inverted their values. Everything that the powerful called good, courage, pride, intensity, assertion of desire, was labeled evil. And everything that was previously despised, humility, obedience, submission, was elevated to the status of virtue. Nietzsche said that this process was born from resentment, a silent poison which transforms incapacity into morality. It is the resentful person who, unable to act, creates a narrative where their weakness is a sign of spiritual superiority. He cannot defeat the warrior, so he creates a world where being weak is being purer. He cannot enjoy life intensely, so he invents a heaven where the poor and humble will be rewarded. He cannot create, so he accuses creation of being vanity. And little by little this inversion spread. In the West, Nietzsche identified Christianity as the greatest driver of this slave morality. Not Christianity as a living spirituality, but as a cultural system that glorified suffering, sacrifice, and renunciation. The promise of an afterworld where the weak would finally be exalted and the strong punished. Thus, what began as impotence turned into moral structure of civilization. And from generation to generation, we learn to admire what diminishes life, and to distrust what intensifies it. Think about it, how many times have you felt guilty for wanting something too big? How many times has the brilliance of your strength been interpreted as arrogance? How many times has vitality been judged as pride? This is the trace of the morals of the weak in us. It disguises itself as kindness, but its root is resentment. It looks like compassion, but it is often fear of life. And Nietzsche, with his sharp gaze, wanted to tear off this mask. Of course, this does not mean that Nietzsche was against compassion or genuine solidarity. What he attacked was the compassion as an excuse for inaction. That pity that doesn't want to see anyone grow, because the growth of others reveals our own stagnation. That kindness that prefers to level everyone down, rather than bear the pain of living with differences in power. Nietzsche believed that humanity was suffocating under the weight of this morality of weakness. Not because she was just fake, but because she denied life itself. And denying life, for him, was the unforgivable sin. Perhaps you already realize how much this criticism still resonates today. We live in an age where fragility is often celebrated as absolute virtue, while strength is accused of oppression. Where resentment hides in moral discourses, and courage is confused with arrogance. Nietzsche would look at this and say, history repeats itself. We are still sick with the same disease. And here we come to the crucial point. Nietzsche did not simply hate the weak. He hated an entire civilization that learned to worship your own weakness. He hated the human habit of transforming impotence into virtue, resentment into morality, fear into holiness. When it is said that Nietzsche hated the weak, it is common for many to interpret this simplistically, as if he had contempt for vulnerable, poor, sick, or sensitive people. But that is not the truth. Nietzsche himself knew the weight of vulnerability. His life was marked by constant physical pain, health crises, loneliness, rejection, and emotional breakdowns. He knew what it was to be fragile. So how could someone who has lived so intimately with pain despise the fragile? That wasn't what Nietzsche hated. What he really hated was the cult of weakness, the human habit of transforming impotence into a throne, resentment into morality, inertia into virtue. This nuance is fundamental. Nietzsche did not condemn suffering itself, but the way we often choose to deal with it. For him, suffering is inevitable, but transforming suffering into a moral banner, an excuse for not acting, poison against others, that was unforgivable. In Genealogy of Morality, he describes how the resentful person creates values that favor him. Unable to act, he transforms his inaction into spiritual superiority. Unable to desire, he condemns desire as sin. Unable to shine, he preaches that humility is the greatest good. Nietzsche saw this process as a kind of moral blackmail. The weak, instead of accepting their condition and seeking to overcome it, demand that the strong bow down, that they hide their vitality, that they be ashamed of their strength. It is as if life, in its power, were forced to apologize for existing. And this is what Nietzsche hated, the imposition of resentment as a universal law. He did not despise those who suffer, but rather the mentality that transforms suffering into an excuse for stagnation, into poison against vitality, into a cult of mediocrity. Think of resentment not as a simple grudge, but as an invisible prison. It is that state in which someone cannot create, so they prefer to destroy. He cannot love, so he condemns the love of others. He can't live, so he calls anyone who dares to live intensely arrogance. Nietzsche realized that this resentment was ingrained in social structures, in religion, in morality, in politics. and that, by becoming the norm, it stifled precisely that which is most human, the capacity to expand, to create, to affirm life despite pain. It's curious to think that Nietzsche experienced this firsthand. His existence was fragile, blinding migraines, chronic stomach problems, and almost unbearable episodes of loneliness. But instead of turning his pain into an excuse, he turned it into creative fuel. His most intense works were born during periods of greatest suffering. He didn't romanticize pain, but he didn't deny it either. He transmuted it into strength, and perhaps therein lies the secret of his philosophy. Therefore, to say that Nietzsche hated the weak is to reduce his criticism to a cruel stereotype. What he hated was the way so many fall in love with their own helplessness, and instead of fighting to grow, they prefer to build an altar to it. He hated the resentment that would rather drag everyone down than bear the pain of seeing someone rise. Deep down, his hatred was paradoxically a calling. A cry for us to stop being intoxicated by our own victimization and instead learn to transform pain into power. And perhaps that call is even more urgent today. Because we live in a time when resentment spreads on social media, where one often gains more prestige through lament than through creation. Nietzsche could not bear to see a humanity so fascinated by its own fragility, so proud of its wounds, but so unwilling to transform them into strength. When Nietzsche spoke of strength, he was not talking about brute force, physical domination, or tyranny over others. His conception was much more subtle, deeper, almost spiritual. Strength, for him, was vital power, the ability to affirm life even in the face of pain, to create new values, to expand despite the weight of existence. This concept finds its most famous expression in the idea of will to power, will to power. But what does this really mean? The will to power is not simply the desire to control as many interpret it. It is the fundamental drive of life, something that goes beyond survival. It is not enough to simply stay alive, as an animal driven by the instinct of preservation would do. Life wants more. It wants to grow, intensify, overflow, express itself. Want to create. For Nietzsche, this was the essence of being human, not living merely to bear the burden of existence, but living as a creator, as someone capable of giving shape to chaos, of transforming pain into art, trauma into wisdom, limitation into style. This is what it means to be strong. Not the absence of suffering, but the ability to do something with it. Here we can draw a parallel with modern psychology. Viktor Frankl, a concentration camp survivor, said that whoever has awe faces almost Anyas. His logotherapy was born precisely from the idea that life gains meaning when we manage to transform suffering into direction, into purpose. And isn't it curious to understand how this vision echoes Nietzsche's philosophy? Pain should not be denied, but rather incorporated, used as a springboard for creating meaning. Another example comes from Carl Jung, a rebellious disciple of Freud. For him, true individuation only happens when a human being integrates his shadow, when he looks at his fears, dark desires and repressed pains, and learns to transform them into consciousness. This is also strength, enduring the encounter with yourself without hiding behind masks. Nietzsche, Frankl, Jung, they all seem to point to the same thing. True power lies not in overcoming the other, but in overcoming one's own tendency to escape, to resentment, to paralysis. Being strong, ultimately, is about enduring all of life, not just the bright parts but also the dark. And perhaps this is why Nietzsche was so implacable against the morality of weakness. Because, by glorifying impotence, it prevents us from experiencing this creative power. It makes us confuse survival with life, comfort with meaning, passivity with virtue. Now look at our modern world. How often do we confuse strength with arrogance, leadership with authoritarianism, ambition with selfishness? And how often, on the other hand, do we celebrate fragility as if it were an end in itself, forgetting that the true value of vulnerability is to drive us to grow? Nietzsche reminds us, life is not neutral. She demands, we either grow or we wither. Either we affirm or we deny. There is no middle ground. And the will to power, when understood, is precisely this call not to waste life in resentment, but to use it to create something greater than ourselves. It is at this point that your philosophy ceases to be just a theory and becomes a personal challenge. Because each of us needs to answer, what am I doing with my pain? Am I hiding behind it, turning it into an excuse? Or am I learning to transmute it into power, into creation, into life? Nietzsche believed that only when we answer these questions honestly do we truly come closer to what it means to be human. And here a profound paradox arises. True strength is not hardness, it is not indifference. She is the courage to feel everything, to go through pain without denying its existence, and still continue creating, affirming, living. It is in this sense that Nietzsche provokes us. Life is not for the weak because life demands it. But it is precisely by enduring this demand that we discover our true greatness. What Nietzsche identified in the 19th century, a civilization shaped by the morality of the weak, by resentment, and by the denial of life, has not disappeared. On the contrary, its symptoms appear to have intensified in the 21st century. We live in a paradoxical era. We have never been so free, but we have never been so fragile. We have access to unlimited knowledge, powerful technologies, possibilities that ancient philosophers could not even imagine. And yet, the prevailing feeling is one of tiredness, vulnerability, helplessness. Part of the answer lies in the way weakness has been culturally reshaped. Today we no longer speak of slave morality in Nietzsche's terms, but we live in a similar atmosphere. A cult of fragility, a celebration of victimhood. On social media this became a spectacle. We live in an age of emotional exposure, where showing one's pain guarantees recognition, empathy, and often even status. Victimization became a bargaining chip. And the resentment that Nietzsche described so starkly now spills over into posts, comments, and virtual lynchings. Here's how it works. Instead of seeking personal growth, we often prefer to point fingers, denounce, and cancel. Energy that could be used to create, expand, and affirm life is used to destroy, level, and diminish. Exactly as Nietzsche described, the resentful person prefers to see the other fall than to bear the weight of his own stagnation. But it's not just on social media that this happens. Contemporary culture seems increasingly inclined to confuse care with infantilization, vulnerability with absolute virtue. Of course, recognizing our own fragility is fundamental. But when this becomes our identity, when we begin to define ourselves only by our wounds, we lose the possibility of transforming them into strength. Nietzsche would warn us, we are intoxicated by the morality of weakness. Not because we are compassionate, but because we find comfort in remaining fragile. Because being fragile today often gets more applause than being strong. And there is something deeply dangerous about that. When strength is confused with arrogance, and weakness is celebrated as the supreme virtue, we risk creating a culture where no one dares to grow, where no one can bear to see another flourish. The result? A society leveled from the bottom where everyone is afraid of their own power. Nietzsche would call this nihilism, a state in which values are emptied, life loses intensity, and we seek meaning only in negation. He believed this would be the greatest challenge of modernity, and looking around, perhaps he was right. Contemporary psychology also notices this phenomenon. Gabor Mate, studying the effects of trauma and addiction, shows how we often transform our pain into fixed identities. Instead of healing, we repeat the same patterns, holding on to the wounds as if they were who we are. It is the psychological version of the morality of weakness. Living trapped in the past, paralyzed, resentful. But Nietzsche would not let us end there. He would not only offer us criticism but also the challenge, transforming vulnerability into creation, into power, into an affirmation of life. He would say that true compassion is not about protecting people from pain, but about helping them discover their strength through it. Now the question that echoes is, how many times have you noticed in yourself this tendency to cling to weakness? How many times have you chosen to play the victim instead of facing the burden of growing up? How many times has your own pain become an alibi for not creating, not acting, not living? These questions are disturbing because they reveal how much the morality of weakness still lives within us. And that is why Nietzsche remains so relevant today. It offers us not solace but a brutal mirror, a reflection that demands more of us than we would like to give. We return to the initial question, why did Nietzsche hate the weak? By now we can see that his hatred was not directed at vulnerable individuals, but at the culture that turns powerlessness into virtue, resentment into morality, and escape from life into religion. Nietzsche hated the idolatry of weakness because, for him, it was a way of betraying one's own existence. But here's the paradox. For Nietzsche, being strong does not mean never falling, never suffering, never bleeding. Being strong means just the opposite. Enduring pain without giving in to resentment, going through suffering without turning it into an excuse, choosing to create even when everything around you suggests giving up. That's why his philosophy continues to resonate like a punch in the gut. Because it forces us to face our tendency towards victimhood, inertia, and fear. And at the same time, it calls us to courage. Not the arrogant courage of dominating others, but the intimate courage of taking charge of our own lives, with all their contradictions. Nietzsche did not want us to be indifferent to pain. He wanted the pain to be embodied, transmuted, transformed into something greater. He wanted us to learn to love life in its totality, not just the pleasure but also the suffering, not just the light but also the shadow. This is the true meaning of his famous concept ofamor fati. To love destiny, to love life exactly as it is, with all its beauty and cruelty. Perhaps, deep down, Nietzsche hated the weak not out of contempt but out of compassion. A hard, uncomfortable compassion that does not accept stagnation as destiny. Perhaps his hatred was, in fact, a passionate call for humanity to stop being intoxicated by its own impotence and learn to live more intensely, more creatively, more freely. And here, before this mirror, each of us needs to ask ourselves, what am I doing with my pain? Am I hiding behind it, hoping the world will revere it as a virtue? Or am I learning to transform it into strength, into power, into life? Nietzsche believed that life requires courage. And it is only by asserting this courage that we become truly human. In the end, his message can be summed up in a provocation. Life is not for the weak. But strength is within reach of all who have the courage to create from pain. And perhaps this is what Nietzsche wanted most. Not to destroy the weak, but to awaken them. Awaken them to the fact that even in suffering there is a spark of power waiting to be asserted. If this reflection touched you, don't let it get lost in silence. Subscribe to the channel The Human Paradox. Because here, together, we are just beginning to unravel the contradictions that make us human.